A wealthy socialite humiliates a stranger at the airport, believing she'll never see him again. But fate has a way of humbling the proud, and soon, their worlds collide in a way she never expected. You won't believe how this story ends. The airport buzzed with the hum of announcements, hurried footsteps, and the soft rolling of luggage wheels across polished floors. The sharp scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, blending with the faint tang of jet fuel from planes just beyond the glass wall. Charlotte Whitmore strode through the terminal like a queen surveying her court. Her silk scarf, a brilliant shade of sapphire, flowed behind her, fluttering with each precise step of her designer heels. Her pristine white coat, untouched by the dirt and grit of the outside world, exuded wealth and control. Her gaze darted from side to side, scanning for anything, or anyone, that dared disrupt her path. "Excuse me," she muttered as she brushed past a family blocking the walkway, her tone sharp enough to make them scatter like startled birds. Her fingers tapped impatiently on the handle of her gold-accented luggage as she approached the security line. She hated airports. People here seemed so ordinary, loud, chaotic. She reached for her phone, perfectly manicured fingers typing a quick message to her personal assistant. "Change the driver for pickup. I want James, not the new one." Her lips pressed into a tight line. Every detail of her life had to be meticulously controlled, curated, and flawless. That was the way of the Whitmore family. But then the unthinkable happened. A sudden jolt. A bump. Her luggage, perfectly balanced at her side, wobbled and crashed to the floor. Charlotte gasped as the world around her seemed to pause. Her phone slipped from her hand, landing with a faint clack against the tile. Her scarf twisted awkwardly around her neck, and her heels clicked sharply as she stumbled to regain her balance. "Watch where you're going," she snapped, turning her glare toward the source of the disruption. Her eyes locked onto a man crouched near her fallen luggage, his rough hands attempting to right the suitcase. "Sorry ma'am," he said, his voice calm, steady, and undeniably sincere. "Didn't see you there." Her eyes narrowed. The man stood slowly, brushing dust from his jacket. His face was weathered, as if carved by the wind itself. His hair was tousled from hours of travel, and his jeans bore faint stains from soil that hadn't come out in the wash. His plain flannel shirt hung loosely over a strong frame, and his boots looked as if they'd walked more miles than her heels ever would. "Didn't see me?" she hissed, her eyes like daggers. "Perhaps if you weren't so preoccupied with playing the role of whatever it is you do, you'd have seen me. People like you ought to be more careful around people like me." She snatched her phone off the ground, holding it up as if inspecting it for scratches. "Do you have any idea what this costs?" The man raised his eyes to hers, his gaze calm but piercing. "It's a phone, ma'am," he said simply, his voice devoid of sarcasm but not of quiet strength. "And I'm not playing any role. Just a man traveling home." Her lips curled into a sneer. "Spare me the humble wisdom act," she shot back, brushing invisible dust from her coat as if his presence had soiled it. "People like you wouldn't know wisdom if it hit you in the face. Next time, stay in your lane." A silence hung between them. Travelers moved past, their footsteps echoing, but the man remained still, eyes fixed on hers. He didn't respond. He didn't fight back. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, slowly, deliberately, as if to say, "I see you. I understand you. And that is enough." Then, without another word, he crouched to retrieve his bag, slung it over his shoulder and walked away. Charlotte stared after him, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. Her heart, however, felt a flicker of something she didn't like, discomfort. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, turning away with a huff. She tapped furiously on her phone, pretending to be busy, pretending to have forgotten the encounter already. But she hadn't. The calm look in his eyes lingered like an echo, his silence more cutting than any insult could have been. 15 minutes later. The sound of fast-approaching footsteps echoed in the terminal. Charlotte turned just in time to see Emily, her daughter, arms wide, grinning from ear to ear. Her blonde curls bounced as she dashed forward, her canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mom?" Emily called, pulling Charlotte into a firm hug. "I missed you." Charlotte hesitated, stiff in the embrace before she finally gave in, patting her daughter's back. "Emily, darling, you look disheveled," she said, pulling back to examine her daughter's wrinkled t-shirt and faded jeans. "You've been gone for 2 weeks, and this is how you present yourself?" Emily laughed, unbothered. "It's an airport, Mom, not a gala." She hoisted her backpack higher on her shoulder. "Besides, I've been working. Actual work, not just posing for photos." Charlotte arched an eyebrow, ignoring the subtle jab. You'll never make connections dressed like that, Emily. People form impressions the moment they see you. Maybe I'm okay with that, Emily replied, unfazed. Her eyes darted around the terminal, bright with curiosity. It's nice to see people without all the pretenses, don't you think? Charlotte sighed. If you want to succeed in life, Emily, you must control how you're seen. People judge. It's the way of the world. Emily's gaze shifted away, her eyes narrowing. Yeah, I saw that earlier, she said, her tone pointed. What's that supposed to mean? I saw you with that guy, the one with the bag, Emily said plainly. I saw how you spoke to him, Mom. It was ugly. Charlotte's eyes darted to her daughter. Ugly? I was holding him accountable. If you'd seen it from my perspective, you'd understand. People like him don't respect order. If you don't remind them, they'll walk all over you. Emily crossed her arms, her expression hard. People like him, huh? You don't even know him. Charlotte straightened her coat, brushing off Emily's words like lint. I know enough. And so will you, once you stop wasting your time on these volunteer projects and start living in the real world. Emily's face went still. She glanced at her mother as if seeing her for the first time. If that's the real world, she said quietly, I don't think I want to live in it. The words stung in a way Charlotte wasn't prepared for. She opened her mouth to reply, but Emily was already walking ahead, her gaze focused straight ahead. Emily? Charlotte called after her, her voice strained. Emily, don't walk away. But she did. She didn't turn back. Charlotte stood there, frozen, watching her daughter move farther away. She felt that same flicker of discomfort, the same feeling she'd had when the man at the airport met her gaze. She shook it off, forcing herself to stand tall. It's nothing. Just a moment. Nothing more. Her phone buzzed in her hand, offering an escape from the weight in her chest. She glanced at it. A message from Valerie. Senator Grant called. Wants to confirm the meeting at 3 p.m. Said it's urgent? Charlotte frowned. Urgent? Senator Grant rarely called meetings on short notice. But she pushed her thoughts aside, tapping out a quick reply. I'll be there. For now, she'd focus on what she could control. The jingle of a brass bell echoed as Emily Whitmore pushed open the door of Harper's Haven, a small family-run coffee shop tucked on a quiet corner of Willow Street. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around her like a blanket, a welcome reprieve from the crisp autumn air outside. The hum of low conversation and the faint hiss of steaming milk gave the space a sense of calm that Emily hadn't realized she needed until now. She glanced around, brushing a few loose curls from her face. Her eyes darted to the corner, where a group of friends laughed over their half-empty mugs. Near the window, an elderly couple sat in quiet companionship, sharing a blueberry scone. Her gaze settled on the counter, where a young man wearing a simple navy apron leaned against the register, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing rough, calloused hands. Emily stepped into line, tapping a rhythm against the strap of her bag. Her morning had been chaotic. A missed bus, an argument with her mother, and a voicemail from her internship coordinator reminding her about a professionalism check-in, whatever that meant. She needed a moment of peace, and Harper's Haven seemed like the perfect spot to find it. When she reached the counter, the young man glanced up from wiping the countertop. His eyes, a soft shade of hazel, locked onto hers with an intensity that caught her off guard. He gave a small nod, his gaze steady, patient, not the fake customer service smile she was used to. Hey there, he said, his voice low and smooth like honey over stone. What can I get for you? Emily blinked, momentarily thrown off. Oh, just a latte. Almond milk, please. He nodded, reaching for a ceramic mug. Almond milk latte. Got it. Need anything sweet to go with that? Muffins just came out fresh. Her lips curved into a small smile. You upsell everyone like that, or am I special? He tilted his head, eyes crinkling with amusement. Depends. You special? Emily let out a soft laugh, caught off guard by the playful tone. I guess I'll have to prove it, she replied, slipping her card out of her bag. Guess you will, he said, tapping at the register. That'll be $4.85. She handed him her card, watching as he swiped it and handed it back. She glanced at his name tag pinned to his apron. Noah B. Thanks, Noah, she said, testing the name. Anytime, Emily, he replied, glancing at her name printed on her card. His grin was small but genuine. As he turned to start her drink, she moved to the pickup counter, letting her bag slip off her shoulder. Her gaze followed him as he worked, each movement precise, deliberate but unhurried. There was something different about him. He moved with purpose, not like someone rushing to finish a shift but as if he found meaning in every small action. She shook her head, brushing away the thought. Don't romanticize strangers, Emily. Her phone buzzed. Mom, where are you? I hope you're not wasting time again. Emily rolled her eyes, shoving the phone into her coat pocket. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. People will only respect you if you present yourself properly, as if her whole life was some kind of performance. She exhaled slowly, gazing out the window. The autumn leaves danced on the sidewalk, free and unbothered by anyone's expectations. Almond milk latte for Emily, Noah called, setting the steaming mug on the counter. She moved toward him, smiling. Thanks. Don't burn yourself, he said with a grin, leaning on the counter. I'd hate to see someone special get hurt on my watch. Emily lifted the cup, feeling its warmth against her hands. Her eyes lingered on him, studying his face for just a moment too long. Something about him was familiar, but she couldn't place it. His confidence wasn't forced and his gaze didn't wander. He didn't seem to care who she was or where she came from. Do you work here every day? She asked, her tone casual but curious. Noah leaned back, wiping his hands on his apron. Nah, just part-time. My family's got a farm just outside of town, so I split my time between here and there. A farm? Her eyebrows lifted, genuinely intrigued. That's not something you hear every day. He shrugged with a small grin. Guess not. But it's honest work. I'm working toward running it full-time one day. There it was again, that calm certainty she couldn't ignore. People she knew were always chasing something: success, wealth, approval. But Noah spoke like he'd already found his path and was just following it at his own pace. She admired that even if she didn't understand it. Sounds like a lot of responsibility, she said, cradling the cup in her hands. It is, he admitted, glancing toward the window. But I'd rather be responsible for something that matters than chase stuff that doesn't. Emily paused, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the latte in her hands. She shifted her weight, her gaze on him. You always this philosophical? Only for people who look like they need it, he replied, meeting her gaze directly. She chuckled, shaking her head. Well, thanks, Socrates. I'll keep that in mind. She glanced at the time on her phone, then sighed. I should probably get going. Shame, he said, resting his arms on the counter. I was just starting to think you might actually be special. Her smile grew wider than she intended, and she hated the warmth that bloomed in her chest. Smooth talker, she thought. Don't fall for it. Maybe next time I'll prove it, she shot back, tossing her hair over her shoulder. I'll hold you to that, he called as she walked away. She didn't turn back. But the grin on her face lingered all the way to the bus stop. Later that week, Emily sat on a park bench, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. Another voicemail from her internship coordinator. Another opportunity for growth that felt more like busy work. She sighed, locking her phone. A familiar voice called from behind. Didn't expect to see you here. She turned, surprised to see Noah approaching, hands in his jacket pockets. He glanced at her, his hazel eyes bright in the soft light of the afternoon sun. Hey, she said, scooting over so he could sit beside her. Didn't expect to see you either. This your usual route? Sometimes, he said, sitting down. I like to clear my head before heading back to the farm. He glanced at her. Rough day? She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. More like a rough week. He nodded, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. You know, Noah said finally, one thing I've learned from working on a farm is that rough weeks come and go. But nothing grows if you stop planting. Emily raised an eyebrow. That another one of your life lessons, farmer boy? Take it or leave it, he replied, flashing her a grin. She laughed, and for the first time all week it didn't feel forced. Walk with me? He asked, standing and offering a hand. She hesitated, glancing at his hand. It wasn't smooth like the people in her world. It was rough, strong, and worn with the weight of real work. This is different, she thought. But she took it. And as they strolled along the park's winding path, the leaves crunching beneath their feet, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a while: peace. Careful, Noah, she said, glancing at him with a playful smile. If you keep talking like that, you'll have me thinking you're special. Maybe I am, he said, his grin easy but sincere. Guess I'll have to prove it. They walked on side by side. The Grand Whitmore estate sat atop the quiet hills of Pine Valley, its sprawling lawn and precisely trimmed hedges a testament to wealth, power, and perfection. The sun glinted off the large bay windows of the mansion, but behind the glass, the glow felt colder than it appeared from the outside. Inside, the house hummed with quiet efficiency. Housekeepers moved swiftly but silently, their presence so well rehearsed it was as if they didn't exist. The faint sound of silverware being polished echoed faintly from the kitchen, and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall marked the slow passage of time. Charlotte Whitmore sat in the solarium, her legs crossed at the ankle, her gaze distant. Her silk blouse, perfectly pressed, shimmered faintly in the natural light. Her manicured nails tapped rhythmically on the side of a porcelain teacup, the delicate clinking sound filling the silence. She wasn't focused on the tea though. Her eyes were locked on the view outside, the pristine garden that she had spent years curating to absolute perfection. But perfection, as Charlotte had learned, was a mask that needed constant adjusting. "You're doing that thing again," came the familiar voice of Valerie Reynolds, Charlotte's oldest and most trusted confidant. Valerie strolled into the solarium, carrying a small leather clutch, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of her friend's posture. She wore her confidence like armor, and her smile was the razor's edge of charm and calculation. Charlotte blinked, turning her head toward Valerie. "What thing?" she asked, her voice as smooth as the surface of the tea in her cup. Valerie raised an eyebrow, tossing her clutch onto a nearby armchair. "That brooding look. The one you do when you're thinking about things you won't say out loud." She slid into the chair across from Charlotte, leaning forward with an interested smirk. "Let me guess, Douglas?" Charlotte didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a slow sip of her tea, savoring the moment of control it gave her. "He's been distant lately," she finally admitted, placing the cup gently on its saucer. Her fingers lingered on the rim. "More than usual." Valerie snorted. "Distant implies he was ever close." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "What did you expect, Charlotte? You two weren't exactly the love story of the century." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't know that, Valerie? I'm not a fool." Her gaze shifted toward the window again. "I know exactly what Douglas and I are. We're partners, not lovers." Valerie leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Partners in business, sure. But lately he's been playing a little fast and loose with that partnership part, hasn't he?" Her eyes flickered knowingly. "The way I hear it, he's been meeting with Preston Tate from Northland Agricole without you." Charlotte's fingers froze. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet Valerie's. "Who told you that?" Valerie shrugged, a sly smile playing on her lips. "I hear things. You know that." Charlotte's expression hardened. Her gaze grew colder, sharper. "Preston Tate wouldn't dare cut me out. We've been backing Northland's expansions for years. Without my name on those accounts, they'd still be haggling over land rights." "True," Valerie admitted, inspecting her nails with a hint of amusement. "But men like Tate and Douglas aren't exactly known for their loyalty, are they?" She glanced at Charlotte with a knowing grin. "They see an opportunity, they take it." Charlotte exhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the handle of the teacup a little tighter than necessary. The cool porcelain pressed into her skin. "If Douglas thinks he can edge me out, he's mistaken." Spoken like a true Whitmore, Valerie quipped. "But be careful, darling. We both know how this game is played. Men like Douglas don't just walk away. They burn the whole board if they think they're losing." Charlotte leaned forward, eyes sharp as daggers. "Then I'll make sure he's the one left holding the match." Later that evening, Charlotte's heels echoed down the marble corridor as she made her way toward Douglas's private office. Her steps were measured but firm, each click of her heel a statement of intent. The heavy oak door was shut, but she didn't knock. She never knocked. Instead, she turned the handle and pushed it open. Inside, Douglas Whitmore sat behind his mahogany desk, phone pressed to his ear. He glanced up, his blue eyes narrowing when he saw her enter. He raised a finger, signaling her to wait, but Charlotte wasn't one for patience. "Wrap it up, Douglas," she said coolly, walking toward him with the poise of a queen approaching her throne. "Now." Douglas's jaw tightened, but he muttered something into the phone and hung up. He leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers laced together over his stomach. His gray suit was impeccable, his silver cufflinks gleaming like coins. "Was that really necessary, Charlotte?" he asked, his tone low and dangerous. "Was it necessary to meet with Preston Tate behind my back?" She shot back, walking behind his chair, her fingertips gliding over the backrest like a predator circling its prey. Douglas let out a short, humorless laugh. "This again?" He shook his head, tilting his chair back. "You're getting paranoid, Charlotte. It's not a good look." "Paranoia," she said softly, leaning down so her lips were close to his ear, "is what keeps people like us at the top." She pulled away, stepping in front of his desk, eyes locked on him. "Don't insult me by pretending I don't know what's happening. I made this family. I built this empire with you. And I will not be pushed out of it. Douglas's smirk faded. His eyes grew colder, harder. He sat forward, resting his elbows on the desk. This family doesn't belong to you, Charlotte, he said quietly. It belongs to us. If you forget that, you'll learn what it's like to be on the outside looking in. Her eyes didn't waver. Is that a threat? It's a reminder, he replied, leaning back again. Don't confuse the two. The next day, Charlotte sat in her study, scrolling through her tablet, eyes darting over financial reports, property deeds, and political contributions. Her breathing was steady, her gaze calm, but her mind was calculating every move she would need to make. She had seen whispers online, mentions of an ongoing investigation linked to Senator Grant. Nothing concrete, but enough to set off alarm bells. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the name. Senator Grant. Her heart didn't race. Charlotte Whitmore didn't panic. She answered the call, her tone sharp and crisp. Senator, to what do I owe the pleasure? Charlotte, Grant's voice came through, smooth but tense. We have a problem. She sat straighter in her chair. Define problem. Certain financial records have surfaced, he said, his voice low like he feared being overheard. My name's on them. Our names are on them. Charlotte's fingers curled slowly, gripping the armrest. What kind of records? The kind that links us to the Northland land acquisition deal, Grant replied. And if you think I'm going down alone, you're mistaken. Her jaw clenched. Her mind spun through contingency plans. How much time do we have? Not enough, he said bitterly. I've got 2 reporters sniffing around and I can't block them much longer. Then buy them off, she snapped. Tried. Didn't work. His voice grew quieter. You might want to start thinking about damage control, Charlotte. This isn't a storm we can ride out. Her eyes flicked toward the window. The sun had disappeared behind a thick layer of clouds. She stared at the horizon, her gaze hard and calculating. Don't call me again, she said coldly, ending the call. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. People like you burn when the storm comes, Senator, she thought. But people like me? We build shelters. The park was quiet except for the rustle of leaves overhead. The autumn air smelled of earth and fallen foliage, and the low sun cast golden beams of light that flickered through the branches. Emily and Noah strolled side by side along the paved path, their footsteps crunching against the fallen leaves. Emily glanced over at Noah, her eyes drifting to the way he carried himself, hands in his jacket pockets, gaze forward, shoulders relaxed like he had all the time in the world. It was a stark contrast to the people she usually found herself surrounded by. No rushing to the next meeting. No endless swiping through notifications. Just presence. You know, Emily said, tugging her scarf tighter around her neck, I don't think I've walked this slowly in years. Noah smirked, tilting his head toward her. You're welcome. She laughed, shaking her head. I'm serious. Usually, I'm checking my phone every 5 seconds or rushing to get to the next important thing. She sighed, glancing up at the canopy of orange and red leaves. Feels kind of nice to just exist. Funny how that works, Noah said. City folk forget how to do that. Everyone's running like they're being chased by something. Because we are, Emily muttered, shoving her hands into her coat pockets. Chased by deadlines. By expectations. By people like my mom. Noah raised an eyebrow, looking at her curiously. Your mom sounds intense. Emily chuckled darkly. That's one way to put it. Every day with her is a new lesson on how to be perfect. Walk straight, smile just enough, speak clearly but not too loudly. It's exhausting. She kicked at a stray acorn on the path, sending it rolling ahead. Sometimes I feel like I'm not living my own life. Just playing a part in her show. Noah was quiet for a moment. Sounds lonely? His words were simple but they hit something deep. Emily's eyes flickered to him. She didn't reply right away, biting the inside of her cheek as if the truth was too close for comfort. Finally, she let out a soft, breathy laugh. Yeah, she admitted. Sometimes it is. They walked a little longer in comfortable silence. The path curved toward a small clearing with a view of the lake. The water shimmered like glass, reflecting the golds and oranges of the trees lining its edge. Noah stopped at the edge of the path, pulling his hands from his pockets. He crouched down, picking up a flat, smooth stone. You ever skip rocks? Not since I was a kid, Emily said, folding her arms across her chest. I was terrible at it. Most people are, he replied, weighing the stone in his hand. He adjusted his grip, then flicked his wrist with a quick, practiced motion. The stone skimmed across the water, hopping once, twice, 3 times before it sank below the surface. Show off, Emily said with a grin. Skill, not luck, Noah said with a wink, picking up another stone. He held it out to her. Your turn? She eyed the stone with suspicion but took it. Turning it over in her hands, she glanced at him. Don't laugh if I fail. Can't make that promise, he said, backing up a step. Emily exhaled, lining herself up with the water. She bent her knees, narrowed her eyes in concentration, and gave it her best shot. The stone flew, then immediately plopped into the lake like a sunken anchor. Noah burst out laughing, doubling over with his hands on his knees. Okay, Emily said, her face warm with embarrassment, but she couldn't help but laugh too. You got one more try, Whitmore, she said, tossing a playful glare in his direction. Only one? He teased, still grinning as he crouched to find another stone. Yep, she said, standing tall and crossing her arms. You'd better make it count. Noah stood, weighing a stone in his hand, giving it a quick toss to test its balance. He squinted at the water, calculating his aim. Watch closely, he said with mock seriousness. This one's gonna be a legend. He wound up and threw, his wrist flicking like lightning. The stone bounced once, twice, 3, 4 times before finally disappearing beneath the water's surface. 4. Noah declared, turning to face her with his arms raised like a triumphant athlete. New park record. Emily tilted her head, hands on her hips. I'm pretty sure there's no official record for that. There is now, he said, walking up to her with a grin that was too infectious for her to resist. Fine, she admitted, laughing softly. I'll allow it. 2 weeks later. The rain drizzled softly outside as Emily leaned back in a booth at Harper's Haven, the cozy cafe where she and Noah had started to spend more time together. Her phone lay face down on the table, silenced. No emails, no notifications, no interruptions. For the first time in a long time, she didn't care what was happening on the other side of that screen. Noah sat across from her, his hand wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. His sleeves were rolled up as usual, exposing his rough, strong forearms. His fingers drummed lightly on the side of his cup as he listened to her talk about her latest internship debacle. And then she told me I needed to recalibrate my approach, whatever that means, Emily said, stirring the foam in her cappuccino with a spoon. Honestly, I think she just likes using words that make her sound smarter. Noah nodded, lips twitching into a grin. Recalibrate, huh? Sounds like she's got a future in politics. Emily snorted into her drink, nearly spilling it. Don't even joke about that, she said, wiping her nose with a napkin. I'd rather be unemployed than work for people like that. Noah's gaze lingered on her for a moment, thoughtful. You ever think about doing something different? Emily frowned. Like what? Something that's yours, he said simply. Not for your mom. Not for the internship. Just for you. His words hung in the air, weighty but not heavy. Emily blinked, her eyes narrowing as if trying to figure him out. You make it sound so easy, she muttered. Didn't say it was easy, Noah replied, his voice calm as ever. But it's simple. You've got one life. Might as well live it the way you want. Emily felt her chest tighten. She leaned back, staring at him for a long moment. How do you always know the right thing to say? He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. Comes with practice. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. No grand gestures. No dramatic declarations. Just quiet understanding. Emily bit her lip, glancing at him, then down at her phone. Her heart thudded in her chest, a little louder than usual. Hey, she said, glancing back up. Come to dinner? Noah raised an eyebrow. Dinner? Yeah. My place, she said quickly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. I mean, not my place. My family's house. I think you should meet them. His eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face. You sure about that? No, she admitted, letting out a breathy laugh. But I want you to come anyway. Noah hesitated, his eyes scanning her face for any hint of doubt. But all he saw was sincerity. He nodded slowly, his grin widening. All right, Whitmore, he said, leaning forward with that familiar, playful glint in his eye. But if it's one of those fancy 6-course dinners with waiters, I'm out. She tilted her head, trying to suppress a smile. Deal. Just, don't be surprised if my mom acts like she's starring in a Broadway show. Noah laughed, his voice rich and warm. I can handle it. Emily leaned her chin on her hand, watching him. Yeah, she said softly, more to herself than to him. I think you can. The Whitmore estate stood like a fortress against the encroaching dusk, its grand columns and vast windows glowing with the soft amber light of luxury. As Noah Benson pulled up the long, winding driveway in his pickup truck, He glanced at the towering mansion with its ornate stonework and perfectly manicured hedges. His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the steering wheel with more force than necessary. "Relax," he muttered to himself as he killed the engine. This wasn't his world. He knew at the moment Emily had invited him. Her nervous smile and the way she'd played with her napkin after asking him to dinner were clear signs she understood the risk she was taking. "But I'm here now," he thought, inhaling deeply before stepping out of the truck. Noah glanced at his reflection in the side window. Dark jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and boots he'd scrubbed clean for the occasion. No suit, no tie, no pretense. If he was going to face them, he'd do it as himself. Take it or leave it, he thought. He approached the front door, steeling himself before pressing the doorbell. The soft, melodic chime echoed inside. Moments later, the heavy door swung open, revealing Emily. Her eyes lit up as soon as she saw him. "You're here," she said, beaming as she stepped aside. "Come in." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, stepping past her into the grand foyer. His boots made soft thuds on the marble floor, and he glanced up at the enormous crystal chandelier hanging overhead. It glittered like frozen rain. Definitely not in Kansas anymore, he thought. Emily tugged at his arm, pulling him further inside. "Don't be weird," she whispered, shooting him a playful grin. "Not making any promises," he muttered back, eyes scanning the room. He could already feel it. The weight of eyes on him, like someone watching from the shadows. "Mom, Dad," Emily called toward the living room. "He's here." Footsteps echoed down the hall. Charlotte Whitmore appeared, gliding into view like she owned the air she breathed. Her sharp eyes locked onto Noah, and for a split second she froze. Recognition. Her pupils dilated. Her lips parted just slightly before her jaw tightened. But it was there. Noah saw it. "She remembers me." But just as quickly, her face smoothed into the flawless mask of polite indifference she wore so well. "Emily, darling," she said, her voice like silk stretched too tight. Her eyes never left Noah. "You must be Noah." "I am," he replied, his tone firm but calm. He extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore." Charlotte's eyes flickered to his hand for a moment too long before she reached out, grasping it lightly, like she was afraid to touch him. Her nails were sharp against his palm, her grip soft but precise, just strong enough to show him she was in control. "Welcome to our home," she said sweetly, but her eyes said something entirely different. "I know who you are." "Thank you for having me," Noah replied, releasing her hand. His eyes stayed on hers longer than necessary, unwavering. "I know who you are too." Douglas Whitmore entered next, loosening his tie as he stepped into the room. His gaze swept over Noah like he was scanning an unfamiliar contract. "This the friend you've been talking about, him?" he asked, his tone sharp but uninterested. "Yep, this is him," Emily said, squeezing Noah's arm affectionately. "Dad, this is Noah." Douglas nodded once, his eyes cool. "Good to meet you, son." "You too, sir," Noah replied, keeping his voice even. "Dinner's almost ready," Charlotte announced, her eyes flicking to Emily. "Why don't you show him the house while I put on the finishing touches?" Her smile was tight, too sharp at the edges. "Sure thing," Emily said, tugging Noah toward the hallway. "Come on. You have to see the gallery. It's ridiculous." Noah glanced over his shoulder as they walked away. Charlotte's eyes followed him like a hawk watching prey. Her gaze wasn't just calculating, it was searching. Dinner time. The dining room was a picture of opulence. The long oak table, adorned with silver cutlery and crystal glasses, stretched far too long for a family of 3. Noah sat next to Emily, across from Charlotte, with Douglas at the head of the table. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the room as servers placed plates of lamb, roasted vegetables, and wine in front of them. "Looks fancy," Noah said quietly to Emily. "Wait till dessert," she whispered back. As they began to eat, the conversation started out polite, almost normal. Emily spoke about her internship. Douglas grunted disapprovingly, and Charlotte smiled as if she cared. But soon the subtle shift happened. Charlotte's eyes flicked to Noah. "So, Noah, Emily tells us you work on a farm." Her tone was light but laced with condescension. "Yep," Noah replied, cutting into his lamb. "My family's farm just outside of Millridge. I help run it when I'm not at the cafe." "How industrious," Charlotte said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "I'm sure it must be exhausting. Farming is such physical work." "It is," Noah agreed, meeting her eyes with quiet steadiness. "But it's honest work. I'd rather be tired from something real than exhausted from pretending to be something I'm not." Charlotte's knife paused briefly over her plate. Her eyes flicked to him, and for the first time that night the mask cracked. Touché, her gaze seemed to say. Emily, oblivious to the subtext, smiled. He's being modest, Mom. He's actually working on a project to bring local produce to more community markets. She nudged him with her elbow. Tell them? Noah leaned back, his eyes still on Charlotte. It's nothing big, he said, his voice calm. Just trying to make sure the community's eating food that's grown right. Charlotte took a slow sip of wine, her eyes locked on him over the rim of the glass. She swallowed, her lips curling into a tight smile. Commendable, she said smoothly. The world always needs more, idealists. Emily frowned. Mom, he's doing real work. Important work. I'm sure he is, Charlotte replied, her gaze darting to Emily with the sharpness of a needle. But we all know that the world isn't kind to idealists, darling. It takes more than dreams to build something lasting. She set down her glass with a faint clink. Her eyes moved back to Noah. Doesn't it? Noah didn't blink. He didn't smile. Yeah, he said slowly. But it's amazing what you can build with just hard work and honesty. The table went quiet for a moment. Even Douglas glanced up from his plate, watching Charlotte for her next move. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes burned. Indeed, she said quietly. Hard work, honesty, and luck. Noah leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes still on her. Luck's for people who wait for things to happen. I don't wait. Another pause. Tension hummed in the air like a live wire. Emily glanced between them, brows raised. Okay, are you two good? She asked, forcing a laugh. Feels like I'm watching a tennis match. Of course, Charlotte said sweetly, flashing a grin that didn't reach her eyes. Noah and I were just getting to know each other. Yeah, Noah added, leaning back. We understand each other perfectly. The night air was cool as Emily and Noah stepped onto the back patio. The stars hung low in the sky, glittering like bits of broken glass. Emily folded her arms against the chill, glancing at him. I know my mom's a little intense, she admitted, but she'll come around. Noah leaned against the railing, gazing at the dark woods beyond the estate. You think so? Yeah, Emily said softly, her eyes full of hope. She just needs time. Noah was quiet for a moment. His jaw shifted like he was holding something back. Your world and mine? He shook his head. They're different, Emily. Yeah, they are, she said, stepping closer. Her fingers brushed his arm. But that doesn't mean we can't build something together. He glanced at her, his eyes searching hers. Slowly, a small smile tugged at his lips. Guess you're right, he said, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The air smelled of damp earth and pine as Noah sat at the edge of the old wooden dock by Millridge Lake. His boots hung just over the edge, his eyes fixed on the water as it shimmered in the early morning light. The calm surface mirrored the pale blue sky above, rippling only slightly with the movement of fish below. But Noah's mind was anything but calm. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, his fingers pressed so firmly together that his knuckles had gone white. His jaw clenched and unclenched with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if he were trying to grind away his own thoughts. Her face, that sharp look, the shift in her eyes. He'd seen it before. Charlotte Whitmore. She wasn't just Emily's mother. She was that woman. The woman from the airport. The woman who made him feel small in front of strangers like he was dirt on her pristine white shoes. He rubbed his hands over his face, letting out a long, slow breath. His heart felt tight in his chest, like a rope was pulling it in two different directions. Why her? He muttered aloud, his voice low and hollow. The water didn't answer. It never did. Noah leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring hard at the reflections on the lake. He tried to piece it together, tried to figure out how fate had played such a cruel joke. He had finally found something good, someone good, and now it came with strings attached. Unseen strings that tied him to a world he'd promised himself he'd never be part of. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the stillness of the moment. He pulled it out, his brows drawing together as he read the screen. Emily, morning, handsome. Coffee later? My treat. Noah exhaled through his nose, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite himself. How does she do that? He thought. She had this way of making him feel light, even when his mind was a storm. He stared at the message for a moment longer than necessary, his thumb hovering over the reply button. But doubt crept in, his smile fading. His mind replayed dinner from the night before. The subtle digs. The barbed compliments hidden in politeness. The way Charlotte's eyes had pinned him to his chair like a nail in a board. He could still hear her voice. Commendable. The world always needs more, idealists. He'd caught the venom in those words even if Emily hadn't. Idealist was her way of calling him naive. He knew that type of language well. It wasn't new to him. People like Charlotte had been using it against people like him for generations. Noah's hands curled into fists. The image of Emily's face floated into his mind, soft and bright like spring after a harsh winter. Emily's not like her mother, he reminded himself. She's not. But the doubt lingered. What if she is? He tapped out a response to Emily's text. Noah, sure. Usual spot? Her reply came almost instantly. Emily, 11 a.m. Don't be late. Noah shook his head, a faint grin returning to his face. Not a chance, he thought. The bell above the door jingled as Noah stepped inside. The familiar smell of roasted coffee and fresh bread filled the air. He spotted Emily immediately, sitting by the window, her blonde curls lit up by the sunlight pouring through the glass. She waved him over, her eyes bright with excitement. Hey stranger, she teased as he approached. You survived dinner with my family. Congrats. That deserves an award. Noah sat across from her, drumming his fingers on the table before locking eyes with her. That wasn't dinner, Emily. That was a battlefield. She tilted her head, grinning. Yeah, Mom can be a little much. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. You have no idea. Her smile faded just slightly. She leaned forward too, eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? Noah paused. He could tell her everything right now. He could say, your mom humiliated me in front of a crowd of strangers at the airport, and she's been trying to do it again ever since. But the words stayed lodged in his throat. Nothing, he said, glancing away. Just saying she's protective of you. That's all. Emily raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. Okay, sure. If protective means acting like a queen guarding her castle. She sipped her latte, sighing as she leaned back in her chair. Honestly, I'm kind of used to it by now. She's always been like that. Doesn't that get old? Noah asked quietly, watching her. Feeling like you have to prove yourself all the time? Emily blinked, surprised by the question. She twirled the straw in her drink, her gaze distant. Yeah, she admitted after a moment. It does? Noah nodded slowly, taking that in. For the first time, he saw something beyond her easy smile. She wasn't just running from her mom's expectations, she was exhausted from it. Guess we're not so different, huh? He said, his voice softer than before. Emily tilted her head, looking at him like she'd never seen him properly until now. Guess not, she said quietly. Her smile was smaller this time, but it was real. Meanwhile, in the Whitmore estate, Charlotte sat at her desk, eyes fixed on the screen of her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed slowly, deliberately. Bank accounts, transfers, investments. Her eyes darted to the small corner of the screen where a name stood out. Northland Agrico, $50,000 transfer pending. Her jaw tightened and she clicked the screen off. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled in front of her mouth. Her gaze shifted toward the window, where rain had started to fall in soft, uneven drops. Noah Benson. Her fingers drummed on the desk as she replayed every word he'd said at dinner. Every glance. Every pointed response. He wasn't like the others. He didn't wilt under her gaze like the interns and assistants she'd put in their place before. He stood his ground. That was dangerous. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She snatched it up, answering without checking the ID. Charlotte Whitmore, she said briskly. It's me, came the voice of Valerie on the other end. Did you check the file I sent you? Charlotte's eyes flickered toward her laptop. I did. And? Valerie's voice was smug. Is it useful? Charlotte exhaled slowly. It's enough, she replied. Her eyes narrowed, gaze sharpening with resolve. Keep digging. I want everything on him. Later that night, Noah sat on the edge of his bed, his phone in his hands. He stared at Emily's name in his contacts, his thumb hovering over the call button. His heart ached in a way he didn't recognize, like it was caught in a tug of war. Tell her the truth, his mind whispered. Tell her about her mom. Tell her now before it gets worse. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. But every time he imagined the look on Emily's face, the confusion, the doubt, the hurt, he stopped. She'd ask him why he didn't say something sooner. She'd wonder if he'd been hiding it all along. And maybe I have, he admitted silently. He tossed the phone onto the bed and leaned forward, head in his hands. This was the part of every story where he'd walk away. He'd seen it a dozen times before. When two worlds don't fit, one of them breaks. It was always the same. But something about Emily was different. She wasn't like Charlotte. She never tried to control him. She never looked at him like he was less. So don't leave, his heart told him. Stay. Fight for her. Noah sat there, still as the night outside, rain tapping softly against the window. His eyes opened, filled with quiet resolve. Yeah, he thought. I'm not going anywhere. The Whitmore estate had never felt so quiet. It was a suffocating kind of quiet, the kind that hums in the air before a thunderstorm breaks. Charlotte sat at the head of the long dining room table, her fingers pressed tightly against her temples. The faint glow from the massive crystal chandelier overhead cast soft light onto the polished wood, but it did nothing to soften the tension in the room. Her phone lay face up on the table, screen black but vibrating every few minutes with incoming calls and notifications. News alerts, emails, messages from people suddenly concerned. All of it was noise she refused to acknowledge. Across the table sat Douglas Whitmore, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. His eyes were cold, narrow slits as he leaned forward, arms resting on the table. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His stare said everything. You should have told me, he said at last, his voice quiet but sharp as a razor. You should have told me this was coming, Charlotte. Charlotte's fingers pressed harder into her temples, her nails digging into her scalp. Don't start, Douglas. Don't start. His voice rose just enough to make her wince. Don't start? The name Whitmore is on every major news outlet right now, and you want me to sit quietly? He slammed his hand on the table, the silverware rattling like a clap of thunder. How much of this did you hide from me? Her eyes lifted slowly, cold and cutting. All of it, she replied bluntly. Because you would have botched it? Douglas blinked, stunned by her honesty. Unbelievable, he muttered, dragging a hand down his face. You've always been arrogant, Charlotte, but this is something else. Her gaze didn't waver. If you think I'm going to beg for forgiveness, save your breath. You knew exactly the type of person you married. Douglas laughed darkly, his voice echoing around the room. Yeah, I did. But I didn't think I was marrying a fool. Charlotte flinched. Douglas stood up, pointing a finger at her. This is on you. All of it. The money transfers, the backdoor deals, all those phone calls you thought I didn't hear. And now, Senator Grant is throwing you under the bus to save his own skin. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You're done, Charlotte. And I'm not going down with you. Her eyes followed him as he walked away, his footsteps sharp and deliberate like the tick of a clock. Her fingers pressed into the table, nails scraping the smooth wood. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked. Breaking news. Senator Grant cooperating with investigators. New documents link Charlotte Whitmore to Northland Agricole scandal. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew this day might come. But knowing something is possible and watching it unfold are two very different things. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a news alert. It was a text from Valerie. Valerie, call me. SAP. Grant's cutting a deal. Charlotte closed her eyes, exhaled through her nose, and let the storm inside her rage quietly. Grant, you coward, she thought. You'll regret this. Later that day, at Harper's Haven Cafe, Emily sat across from Noah in their usual spot by the window, but for once she wasn't smiling. Her phone sat on the table in front of her, face up, displaying the same breaking news alert that Charlotte had seen. She stared at it like it might explode. I don't understand, she muttered, her voice shaky. I knew she had secrets, but this? She shook her head. Money laundering? Bribes? Land seizures? It's too much. Noah watched her carefully, his coffee untouched. He'd seen this moment coming. He just didn't know how it would hit her. You're not responsible for her choices, Emily, he said softly. You know that, right? Her eyes darted up to his, wild and hurt. But I am Noah. I'm her daughter. My name is tied to hers like it or not. People see me, they see her. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her palms. Do you know how many times she told me to present myself properly so I wouldn't embarrass the family name? And now she's the one embarrassing us. Noah frowned. You're not her. Emily dropped her hands and stared at him. Aren't I, though? Her voice cracked. She's in me, Noah. Every choice she's made, every lesson she drilled into my head about power, control, appearances, that's all in me too. Noah reached for her hand, his fingers rough but steady. You choose who you are, Emily. Not her. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face. Slowly she nodded, her breathing still uneven but steadier than before. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. Douglas, come home. We need to talk. She swiped it away. I don't want to go back there, she muttered. Not tonight. Then don't, Noah replied simply. She looked at him, her eyes tired but grateful. Can I stay with you? He smiled softly, squeezing her hand. Yam. You can. Later that evening at the Whitmore estate, Charlotte stood at the large bay window in the living room, one hand wrapped tightly around a glass of scotch. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes hollow but sharp as ever. Rain slid down the glass in slow, lazy streaks. Her phone buzzed on the end table. This time she didn't hesitate. She answered. Valerie, she said, her voice cold. Charlotte, you're running out of time. Valerie's voice came fast, like she was speaking through clenched teeth. Grant's giving them everything. You think he's going to spare you? They've got your name on at least 3 transfers to Northland Agricco. I know, Charlotte replied calmly, taking a slow sip of scotch. But I have leverage. Valerie snorted. You better hope so, because if this goes public you'll be finished. No more clubs, no more charity galas, no more political connections. You'll be just another headline in a tabloid. Not if I play it right, Charlotte said, her eyes narrowing as she watched the rain fall. They want a villain, Valerie. I'll give them one. Be careful, Charlotte, Valerie warned. They don't just want a villain. They want blood. In the living room, the door slammed shut. Emily's footsteps echoed through the marble hall as she walked in, her soaked coat dripping on the floor. She found Charlotte still by the window, the scotch glass nearly empty. Nice of you to come home, Charlotte said, not turning around. I didn't come for you, Emily shot back. Her voice was hard, raw with emotion. Charlotte turned slowly, her eyes locking on her daughter. Her lips curled into something like a smile, but there was no joy in it. Then why are you here? To tell you that I'm done, Emily said, stepping forward. Her eyes, so much like Charlotte's, burned with something fierce and unyielding. You taught me how to stand up for myself, Mom. You taught me how to see people for who they really are. Charlotte tilted her head, watching her like a predator sizing up prey. And who do you see, Emily? Emily stepped closer, her voice breaking with raw pain. I see a hypocrite. I see a woman who spent her whole life telling me to be better while doing the worst things imaginable. I see an oppressor. Her eyes welled with tears, but her voice didn't falter. And I'm not going to be like you. Charlotte's mask finally cracked. Her eyes widened, her lips parting as if to reply. But no words came. She watched as her daughter turned, walking back toward the front door. You'll come back, Charlotte called after her, her voice sharp and brittle. You'll realize you can't run from this family. Emily didn't stop walking. I'm not running, she said quietly, reaching for the door handle. I'm breaking free. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. Charlotte stood in the empty room, alone. Her scotch glass trembled in her hand. She watched the rain pour harder, her reflection barely visible against the storm outside. Her phone buzzed again. But this time she didn't answer. The first light of dawn crept through the slatted blinds of Noah's apartment, painting stripes of gold and gray across the hardwood floor. Noah sat at the small kitchen table, his phone in one hand, his other tapping rhythmically against the edge of his coffee mug. His eyes were locked on the screen, a steady stream of texts flying back and forth. Noah to Jake Harmon, it's all here, Jake. Everything you need. Dates, names, transfers. They can't bury this. Jake Harmon replied, this is dynamite, man. But it's risky. You sure you want to do this? Noah's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the couch, where Emily lay wrapped in a blanket, her head resting on the armrest. She'd barely slept since the night she confronted her mother. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, the screen dim but buzzing occasionally with unread messages from her father, Douglas. She hadn't responded to any of them. Noah glanced back at his phone. His fingers hovered over the keys. Noah, reply, yeah. Publish it. All of it. He hit send, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no going back now. Later that morning, Charlotte Whitmore sat at the marble counter in her kitchen, her hands folded neatly around a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. She watched the news on the mounted television with a vacant stare, her eyes fixed but distant. Investigators have obtained documents implicating Senator Grant and several unnamed business associates in illegal land acquisitions and fraudulent financial activities. While names remain unconfirmed, sources indicate one of the associates is a prominent figure in the world of high society. Charlotte's grip on the cup tightened. Her phone buzzed on the counter beside her. She glanced at it, expecting another reporter's number she'd have to ignore, but it wasn't a reporter this time. It was a name she knew too well. Grant, incoming call. Her jaw clenched. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a second before she swiped to answer. You really have some nerve, she said coldly, placing the phone to her ear. Don't act righteous, Charlotte, Grant's voice hissed through the receiver. You and I both know you're not the victim here. Then why are you calling me, Grant? Her voice was cool but firm. Sounds like a man desperate for a way out. Watch it, he growled. You're on that list too, remember? Don't think for a second that I won't drag you down with me if I have to. Her eyes flickered toward the window, her gaze sharp as steel. You don't scare me, Grant. And if you think I'm going to take the fall for you, you've underestimated me. There was a pause on the other end. Then a low chuckle. Is that so? Grant's tone was venomous. You think you're untouchable, huh? Look around, Charlotte. Your house of cards is falling. Everyone sees it. Her fingers drummed on the counter, each tap precise and deliberate. The difference between you and me, Grant, she said softly, is that I can still rebuild. She ended the call and dropped the phone onto the counter. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, unblinking. Let it fall, she thought. Let it all fall. The plan comes together, Noah's apartment. Noah, Emily, and Jake Harmon gathered around the kitchen table. Jake, a journalist for the Ledger Review, scrolled through pages of files on his laptop, his eyes darting back and forth as he made notes in his spiral notebook. His fingers flew across the keys, typing faster than Noah thought was humanly possible. All right, Jake muttered, his eyes locked on the screen. We've got wire transfers from offshore accounts, payments from Northland to Grant's shell companies, and, yep, Charlotte Whitmore's signature on 3 of them. He glanced up at Emily, raising an eyebrow. You sure you want to do this? This will blow your family's name to pieces. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the documents. Her fingers tugged at the sleeves of her sweater, a nervous habit Noah had picked up on. Yeah, she said firmly, her voice more sure than her hands. My mom built that name on lies. If it burns, it burns. Jake let out a short, impressed laugh. All right, Whitmore, he said, leaning back in his chair. Didn't think you had it in you. Me either, she muttered, eyes still on the files. But I'm done living in her shadow. Jake turned back to his laptop. This is going live in 48 hours. The editors will want a full fact check, but with what you've given me, they won't hesitate to push it. You're sure about going public? Noah glanced at Emily, and for a moment, he saw doubt flicker in her eyes. She met his gaze, searching for reassurance. He nodded. You've got this, his eyes said. Emily exhaled slowly, like she was letting go of a weight she'd carried for years. Do it, she said. Publish everything. Are you out of your mind, Emily? Douglas's voice thundered over the speakerphone on the next day. Emily stood in Noah's kitchen, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her father's voice was sharp as broken glass, every word cutting deeper. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know how many people you've put at risk? People? She shot back, her voice sharp with anger. The only people I'm worried about are the ones you and Mom have been stepping on for years. You're naive, Emily, Douglas hissed. You think you're being brave, but you're just a pawn. Those reporters don't care about you. They'll use you, spit you out, and walk away. Better to be a pawn doing something right, she snapped, than a king doing nothing. Silence. Heavy, cold silence. You've made enemies, Emily, Douglas said, his voice quieter now but no less dangerous. Don't come running to me when they come for you. Don't worry, she replied, ending the call. I won't. On the day of the release, Charlotte sat in her living room, TV on low, but the volume didn't matter. The images on the screen spoke louder than words. Footage of Grant being approached by journalists outside his estate. Footage of the Whitmore estate. Footage of her face on the front page of the Ledger Review. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Valerie. Charlotte, Valerie's voice was tense. They're coming for you. You have maybe an hour before the reporters are on your doorstep. Charlotte's fingers hovered over the screen, her heart steady, her mind clear. Let them come. Charlotte, this isn't like before, Valerie warned. You can't win this one. Maybe not, Charlotte replied, glancing at the television where her face stared back at her, cold and regal. But if I'm going down, I'm not going down quietly. She ended the call. The cameras flashed outside as the first reporters gathered beyond the iron gates. Charlotte stood, smoothing the front of her blouse. She walked to the door, heels clicking like the ticking of a clock. When she reached the grand entryway, she looked at the massive door and for a brief moment she hesitated. But only for a moment. Her fingers grasped the handle, pulled it open, and stepped into the flash of cameras, her face calm as stone. Her voice was steady as she spoke. I have a statement. The world didn't stop for scandals, but it certainly watched. Every major news network had its cameras fixed on the front steps of the Capitol Courthouse. Reporters jostled for position behind the metal barricades, microphones raised, cameras flashing like a summer storm. The crisp fall air was sharp with the scent of rain, and the gray clouds overhead seemed ready to burst. The hum of the crowd grew louder as the courthouse doors swung open. Out stepped Charlotte Whitmore. Gone was the perfectly curated image she had spent years crafting. There was no shimmering scarf, no signature white coat. Instead, she wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled into a low, neat bun. Her face was bare of makeup, her eyes focused straight ahead. The flash of cameras was blinding. "Charlotte, do you have any comment on today's hearing? Did you really transfer funds to Northland Agrico? Is it true Senator Grant has implicated you as the mastermind?" The questions flew at her like darts, but Charlotte didn't flinch. Her heels clicked steadily on the pavement as she walked down the stone steps toward the hearing chamber. The world was watching, and for the first time in her life she didn't care. Inside the courthouse, the hearing room was stark, its fluorescent lights cold and unforgiving. Wooden pews lined either side, packed with journalists, legal aides, and a few curious members of the public. At the front of the room sat a long panel of government officials, their eyes sharp as hawks as they prepared to pick apart every word that left Charlotte Whitmore's mouth. She sat at the witness table, a microphone inches from her face, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. Her attorney, Ethan Grant, a distant cousin of the senator but far less corrupt, sat beside her, flipping through a thick binder of documents. "Ms. Whitmore," said one of the panel members, a woman with short gray hair and a sharp voice. "You're aware of the seriousness of these allegations, correct?" "I am," Charlotte replied, her voice clear, even. The panelist glanced at her papers. "You've been implicated in multiple financial transfers to accounts linked to shell companies owned by Northland Agrico. Do you deny that your signature appears on those documents?" "No," Charlotte said plainly. "I do not deny it." There was a murmur of surprise from the crowd. Ethan Grant glanced at her from the side, his eyes sharp with warning. She wasn't supposed to admit that so quickly. But she didn't look at him. Her eyes remained on the panel. "Let me be perfectly clear," Charlotte said, leaning slightly toward the microphone. Her voice was firm but not defensive. "Yes, I signed those documents. Yes, I knew what I was doing." The crowd erupted. Reporters leaned forward, typing furiously on their laptops. Flashes from cameras lit up the room. Ethan's eyes darted toward her, his jaw tight. "Charlotte," he whispered sharply. "Stay on script." But Charlotte pressed on, her eyes unflinching. "I signed them because I believed I was untouchable. Because I believed that success meant never being questioned, never being challenged." Her voice wavered slightly, but she held steady. "But I see now that power like that is hollow. I see now that I wasn't building an empire. I was building a prison for myself." The room fell silent. Even the sharp click of camera shutters had stopped. "I am guilty," Charlotte said, her voice soft but resolute. "I am guilty of greed. I am guilty of pride. And I am guilty of thinking that I could outrun consequences forever." She raised her eyes to meet the panel's gaze directly. "But I will not run from them anymore." Her words echoed in the stillness of the room. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. One of the panelists, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice cautious, "are you confessing to criminal activity today?" "Yes," Charlotte replied, her voice unwavering. "I am." The room erupted again. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose, eyes shut tight. Charlotte sat perfectly still. Her eyes didn't move. Her breathing was slow, even. The storm she had been running from for years had finally caught her, and she was letting it wash over her. Meanwhile, at Harper's Haven Cafe, Emily sat in the corner booth, her phone propped up in front of her, live-streaming the hearing. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. She watched every moment, every word, every glance her mother gave as if it were a story she couldn't look away from. Her hand hovered over her coffee cup, but she didn't drink. She didn't even notice when Noah slid into the booth across from her, wiping rain off his jacket. "Any updates?" he asked, shaking water from his hands. Emily didn't answer. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen. "She confessed," she said, her voice so quiet it barely sounded like her own. "She admitted to everything." Noah stopped mid-motion, glancing at the screen. The image of Charlotte sitting at the witness table was frozen on the screen, her face set in that sharp, regal calm she always wore in public. But there was something different about her now. "She's taking the hit," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "She's not running?" Noah leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the screen. "Didn't think she had it in her." Emily let out a soft, shaky laugh, but it wasn't from joy. "Neither did I." Her hand hovered over the screen, her fingers brushing lightly against the image of her mother's face. The woman she'd spent years trying to please. The woman she'd fought with, yelled at, cried about. The woman she thought she'd never understand. "Maybe she's not as heartless as I thought," Emily said quietly. "Maybe," Noah replied. "People surprise you sometimes." Emily glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. "Yeah," she said softly. "They do." Charlotte walked down the courthouse steps. The flash of cameras lit up the gray sky, but this time, it didn't feel blinding. It felt like sunlight after a storm. She didn't walk quickly. She didn't hide. She walked slowly, steadily, as if every step mattered. A sea of reporters surrounded her, shouting questions, microphones shoved into her path. "Ms. Whitmore, how do you feel after admitting your crimes? Was this a legal strategy or genuine remorse? Do you have anything to say to your family?" She paused. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment she saw Emily's face in her mind. Her daughter's face. Her strength. Her defiance. Charlotte raised her head, her voice calm but firm. "I have a lot to say," she said, her eyes steady on the cameras. "But I'll start with this: I was wrong." A hush swept over the crowd. Reporters leaned forward, mics raised. "For too long I thought winning was all that mattered. But I see now that winning doesn't mean a thing if you lose yourself in the process." She glanced toward the camera, her eyes narrowing as if she were speaking directly to Emily. "I'm going to make it right. No matter what it costs." The cameras flashed like lightning. Later that night, Emily sat on the couch with Noah beside her. The TV played the news recap of the hearing, but she wasn't watching. Her head leaned on Noah's shoulder, her eyes closed, her heart feeling something it hadn't felt in a long time: relief. "Proud of her?" Noah asked quietly, his fingers brushing through her hair. "Not yet," Emily replied, her voice soft but steady. "But maybe I will be." Noah nodded, leaning his head against hers. "People surprise you," she said again, her voice quieter this time, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "Yeah," Noah replied, his voice low but certain. "They do." The Whitmore estate, once the symbol of wealth and untouchable power, now stood hollow and quiet. Movers carried boxes down the marble steps to a row of trucks parked in the circular driveway. Every thud of a box hitting the truck bed echoed like a closing chapter. Charlotte Whitmore watched from the front steps, her arms crossed over a plain gray sweater. No designer coats, no gold-trimmed scarves. Her hands rubbed slowly over her arms as if brushing away the cold, but her gaze remained fixed on the movers. "Last one, Ms. Whitmore," said one of the workers as he walked past, carrying a box labeled books. "Thank you," Charlotte replied, her voice quieter than it used to be. She glanced down at the final item in her hands, a silver picture frame. Inside was a photo of Emily at age 12, grinning at the camera with a face covered in cake frosting. Charlotte's younger self sat beside her, smiling, but it was a smile she recognized now as practiced, not real. She turned the frame over in her hands, her eyes misty but dry. After a moment, she placed the frame inside a nearby box and closed the lid. "Ma'am," came a voice from behind. It was Valerie. Dressed in her sharp business attire, Valerie approached carefully, glancing around at the sight of the movers finishing their work. "You're really doing it, huh?" Charlotte exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. "Yes, it's done." Valerie raised an eyebrow, her arms folding. "Selling the estate, donating half your fortune to charity, who are you trying to impress?" Charlotte turned, looking Valerie square in the eyes. "No one," she said, her voice sharper than it had been in weeks. "That's the point." Valerie smirked, letting out a short laugh. "Never thought I'd see the day." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "But listen, Charlotte, you walk away from this and you lose everything. Everything. No more favors. No more open doors. No more safety net." "Good," Charlotte said, her eyes clear, her back straight. "I'm tired of nets." They stood in silence for a moment until Valerie shook her head, letting out a dry chuckle. "Well, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." "I already have," Charlotte replied, her gaze drifting toward the road ahead. Charlotte Whitmore's journey took her from power and pride to humility and redemption. Do you believe she truly changed, or was she simply playing a role to regain control of her life? Would you have forgiven her if you were in Emily or Noah's position? What would you have done differently if you were in Charlotte's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments.